pictures of women holding guns. Looking at the images of modern Israel, immersed in a contemporary lifestyle, it's hard to imagine that this country was built upon centuries of sorrow, hardship, and a history stained with blood. In fact, Israel is the only country in the world that is ruled by Jews, that is, the Jewish people. Before the 1940s, Jews were scattered across different corners of the world. Europe in particular had become their home. But the way Hitler's Nazi army brutally killed the Jews during World War II and how no country made any significant effort to save them. In such a situation, the Jewish people began to demand their own country, where they could live with dignity and provide a secure future for the coming generations. When millions of Jews were killed during Hitler's regime, the Jewish people of Europe, especially Germany, turned towards a small region on the Mediterranean Sea known as Palestine. Jews from Africa, Europe, and other parts of the world also began moving towards Palestine. At this time, they dreamed of having their own land, of being among their own people, and of creating a country of their own, where their fate would not be decided by Europeans. But the question arises, why did Jews from all over the world move specifically towards Palestine? Why did they call this small country their own? To understand the history of the Jews and the story of Israel, let's turn the pages of history. The story begins almost 4,000 years ago. At that time, there was the Mesopotamian civilization, where idol worship was encouraged. At this time, there was no particular religion here and society had not yet evolved. It was during this time that Hazrat Ibrahim was born here, from whom the Abrahamic religions began. His descendants gave rise to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Anyway, Hazrat Ibrahim gradually moved to the land of Canaan, which is part of present-day Israel and Palestine, and began to teach people about religion. He established a religion which was named Judaism. The followers of Ibrahim came to be known as Jews. Ibrahim had two sons, one named Ismail and the other Isaac. During their time as well, they continued to follow Judaism, and their followers also grew in large numbers. However, later on, Isaac's sons became known as Jacob in Christianity, Israel among the Jews, and Yaqub among Muslims. They carried forward Judaism. But then Jacob married 4 times, resulting in 12 sons who formed 12 different tribes and began to rule. One of these sons was Judah. It was he who, for the first time here, established the Jewish religion. But as time passed, a terrible famine struck here, causing the Jewish people to gradually migrate to neighboring countries. Most Jews in those days settled in Egypt, because wherever the Jews went, they would establish settlements and they used to live in groups. That's why they were always ahead in business. Because of their abilities, the king of Egypt started to fear them. He thought that if the number of Jews kept increasing like this, then the day was not far when they would take over Egypt and start ruling it themselves. Their growing population and prosperity started to make the king restless. Soon after, the king issued such an order to curb the influence and families of the Jews that it sent chills down everyone's spine. In fact, the king of Egypt ordered all Jewish men and boys to be killed, which pushed Jewish women into slavery. As a result, not only did the Jewish population decrease in the early days, but many Jews also started looking for ways to escape to other kingdoms. It was during this time that Moses was born into a Jewish family in Egypt. He managed with great difficulty to gather the Jews living in Egypt and, after crossing a difficult path, returned to Israel with his Jewish caravan. After this, Moses began to be seen as a religious leader. His respect among the Jewish people started to grow significantly. When all the Jews arrived in Israel together with their caravan from Egypt, Moses gave them the 10 Commandments from God, teachings that, if followed, would always keep the Jews happy and prosperous. He had these 10 teachings inscribed on a stone and placed in a social center, which came to be known among the Jews as the 10 Commandments of the Supreme God. In this way, after a long struggle, the Jews finally found a permanent place to live. Sometime later, King Saul established the Kingdom of Israel, which became the Jews' own empire. Around 1000 BC, King David, who was King Saul's son, became the first powerful king of the Jewish people. His son, King Solomon, who is known among Muslims as King Suleiman, he built the first Jewish social worship center, the Temple Mount, in Jerusalem, the capital of Israel. It was called the First Temple or Solomon's Temple. Since Jews rejected idol worship, the stone tablets bearing the 10 Commandments given by Prophet Moses were placed in this temple. But soon after, a civil war broke out here, and the people split into two ethnic groups. King Solomon emerged as the leader of the powerful Jewish race. Happiness and immense wealth showered upon them here. But after just 2 centuries, a king from Mesopotamia, Shalmaneser V, attacked, in which thousands of Jews were killed again, and the capital Jerusalem was brutally plundered. Somehow, the Jews managed to rebuild themselves and their kingdom. But in 587 BC, a major event took place. During this period, several wars occurred, in which Jerusalem was devastated. At that time, under the orders of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, the entire Judah community was plundered, and a horrific massacre took place, which once again, the people survived. The Babylonians took them away as slaves. The Babylonian kingdom destroyed the kingdom of Judah. After this, the Jews remained under Babylonian control. The Babylonians also destroyed their first holy temple, and during this time, thousands of Jews were sent into exile for 70 years. Many Jews fled Israel and scattered to the far corners of the world. After this event, both Jerusalem and the Jews were completely wiped out from Israel. Sometime later, a new empire arose in Iran known as the Persian Empire. The Persian kings conquered many regions, including parts of the Mediterranean Sea, Babylon, and Egypt, establishing a vast Persian empire in which the Jews were granted some freedom. They freed the Jews who had been brought to Babylon as slaves during the exile and ordered them to return to Israel and make the land of Israel flourish once again. The Persian king Cyrus II also granted the Jews permission to rebuild their temple. After this, the Jews returned to Israel and rebuilt their temple at the same place. This was called the Second Temple. Here, the Jews began their lives anew, but this place was always entangled in wars and attacks. After some time, Alexander conquered the Persian Empire, and then Jerusalem came under Alexander's control. After the fall of Alexander's kingdom, by 63 BC, Israel became part of the Roman kingdom. It was during the Roman kingdom that Jesus Christ was born into a Jewish family. Gradually, he became very popular among the people and claimed to be the Son of God. Soon, his followers began to spread throughout Jewish society. People were greatly influenced by his words and started coming to witness his miracles. This did not sit well with the Jewish religious leaders. They began to spread things against Jesus. The Jews refused to accept Jesus as their God's messenger. They began to reject the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, and around 30 to 33 AD, Jesus was crucified with the claim that he was speaking against the religion. However, crucifying Jesus turned out to be a heavy blow for the Jews. The number of Jesus' followers began to increase in the Roman Empire. Many Jews also began to follow Christianity. This increased the problems for the Jews even more. In fact, due to the growing Christian population among the Romans, many Jews also started following Christianity. Because of this, the Jewish religious leaders united and revolted against the Romans, which is known as the First Jewish-Roman War, in order to drive Christians out of Israel and free themselves from Roman rule. People everywhere began to form groups and refused to recognize the authority of the Roman Empire. When the Jews first raised their voices for their rights and began to refuse to accept the Roman kingdom, then the Romans surrounded all of Jerusalem from every side and cut off the food supply, causing the Jews to die of hunger. After this, they began killing the remaining people and eventually set all of Jerusalem on fire. During this time, the Romans also burned down the Jews' second temple, of which only a single wall remains in Jerusalem today. This event came to be known as the Siege of Jerusalem. In this conflagration, millions of Jewish families were killed, and those who survived were either forced to convert or sold into slavery. Atrocities against Jewish women increased even more, and Jewish men and children were even killed. During this period, the Romans not only killed millions of Jews, but also enslaved millions, and those who survived were subjected to heavy taxes. To erase all traces of Israel, the Romans changed the name of Jerusalem to Aelia Capitolina. Around the same time, the Romans also changed the name of a small region of Israel known as Judea to Syria Palestina, which later became known as Palestine. Gradually, in this very Palestine, the followers of Jesus began to promote Christianity. However, at that time, even the kings of the Roman Empire were against Christianity, so the people living in Palestine practiced this religion secretly. In the early days, this religion did not spread much. The Roman Empire ruled until 324 AD, but after that, the Roman kingdom broke apart, and eventually the Byzantine Empire, which was a part of the Roman Empire, seized control of Jerusalem from 324 AD onwards. The power of the Roman Empire came into the hands of Constantine, who was known as the Great Emperor. Constantine himself was greatly influenced by Christianity and the teachings of Jesus. That is why he had a church built in Jerusalem at the site of Jesus' tomb and accepted Christianity. This church was named the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. After this, the Byzantine Empire declared Christianity as its official religion. Now, since the Jewish people did not accept Jesus' teachings and had supported his crucifixion, they once again became the target of this new empire. Once again, the persecution of Jews began. During this time, once again, thousands of Jews converted to Christianity, and those who did not convert began to face persecution again. Because the Byzantine Empire knew that if the Jews were given even a little freedom, they would not hesitate to establish their own kingdom. That is why, during this period, they created many rules that gradually stripped the Jews of their power. According to some rules, Jews were not allowed to keep any slaves or servants for themselves. Marriages between Jews and non-Jews were also banned. Jews were not allowed to build community worship centers, nor were they permitted to gather in large numbers for prayers. There were also provisions to punish Jews who did not follow all these rules. Their property would be confiscated, and in many cases, they were either imprisoned or directly sentenced to death. The Jews spent several more centuries living such a miserable life. In 638 AD, after defeating the Byzantine Empire, the Arab army of Umar captured Jerusalem, after which the entire region of Syria-Palestine came under Arab rulers. During the Arab rule, they named the place Palestine. From 638 to 1099, Palestine remained under the Islamic period, during which Jews were granted a certain degree of freedom. During this time, millions of Jews converted to Islam and began to call themselves descendants of Abraham. During this period, the Jews flourished greatly. The Muslim Caliph invited Jews from all over the world to return to Jerusalem. During this period, Jews living in nearby regions once again moved towards Israel. However, after wandering for the past 500 years, many Jews had now settled in Africa, Europe, especially in areas around Spain, Germany, and Russia, and had established small settlements there. During this time, Islam spread everywhere, and Jews also began to settle in different parts of the world. Until 1099, Jews were living a good life, but by the 11th century, Europeans were conquering every place they could find by discovering sea routes. During this time, they also conquered Palestine and began killing the people living there. Apart from this, in other parts of Europe where Jews had already been living, persecution against them also began. In fact, almost all European countries had started following Christianity, and they believed that it was the Jews who had crucified Jesus, a consequence for which they were still paying the price even 1,000 years later. European Christians not only captured Palestine and Jerusalem, but also made the lives of the Jews living there miserable. They believed that Jerusalem, where the tomb of Jesus was located, should be taken from the Arab Muslims, and that the Jews, who were considered responsible for Jesus' death, should be eliminated. This era began in 1095 and continued until 1291. During this period, there were terrible wars between Muslims and Christians, which were also called Holy Wars. In fact, both Jews and Muslims considered Jerusalem their holy land. But Christians also regarded this place as their holy land and wanted to claim it for themselves. In this war, Muslims and Jews joined forces to fight against the Christians in order to prevent them from reaching Jerusalem. In this war, millions of people on both sides were killed, especially the Jews who were living in this region. More than half of their population was wiped out in this war. It was destroyed. Apart from this, wherever Jews were seen in Europe, Christians began burning them alive. This way of life and slavery of the Jews continued until the arrival of the Ottoman Empire. In the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire did capture Salem. At that time, large parts of Europe were also under the rule of the Ottoman Empire, where Jews were given a bit more freedom. However, even in those days, Jews were not living a good life. But still, compared to the way Christians were treating Jews in Europe, the Jews in the Ottoman Empire had a better life. The Ottoman Empire not only restored religious freedom to the Jews, but also gave them the opportunity to live a better life again. They also tried to resolve the complicated Holy Land disputes in Jerusalem. In fact, they separated the entrance to the Mount Temple Wall and Mosque from the entrance to the church in the region known as Palestine. Arrangements were made for everyone so that people would not go to war with each other in the name of religion. This effort by the Ottoman Empire was indeed quite effective in Jerusalem. For a long time, there were no religious wars between these three religions. But how could the fate of the Jews ever leave them alone? Because they had been fleeing for the past 2,000 years, most Jews had now settled in parts of the Mediterranean Sea and Europe. But now, anti-Jewish sentiments began to spread all over Europe. Christians now started finding baseless reasons to kill Jews. The hatred that spread against Jews during this time was called anti-Semitism, which meant discriminating against Jewish people on the basis of religion and race. This discrimination was not at a normal level. In fact, anti-Jewish people considered Jews to be a stain on society. They were kept away from community or society's social welfare schemes and benefits. Many times they were burned alive on accusations of breaking religious rules or practicing black magic. By the 18th century, anti-Semitism began to spread throughout the empires of Europe, and Jews were left struggling for every breath. Day after day, they faced beatings, slavery, and massacres. Anti-Jewish groups, especially Christians, began massacring Jewish people. Women, men, children, even pregnant women were gathered together and burned alive. Thousands of Jews were expelled from France and other parts of Europe. It was made compulsory for Jews to wear a yellow badge so that people could identify them socially. Jobs, social reservations, interreligious marriage, these things were banned for Jews. Even those who converted from Judaism to Christianity were not treated well in Europe. All in all, due to anti-Semitism, Jews were brutally mistreated throughout Europe. With time, things did not change. In fact, the situation of the Jews' life became even more difficult. They had separate penal codes for them. They were killed for even the smallest reasons, and after a few years, wars would break out to expel them from the country. Christians believed that Jews only cared about their own welfare and only thought about themselves. That is why they believed Jews should have no right to live a social life. In such circumstances, millions of Jews, troubled, began fleeing towards America. During this time, in the 18th century, when the French Revolution took place, Jews got a chance to live a good life during Napoleon's era. But with the end of Napoleon, the final moments of happiness in the lives of Jews also came to an end. But this constant fleeing began to become unbearable for their generations. Gradually, Jews started demanding their own land. Most of their demand was directed at European countries because it was due to them that Jews were becoming homeless in modern times and were being forced to live their lives running from place to place. Because of the mistreatment happening around the world, the Jewish community everywhere began to feel that if they wanted to live a peaceful life, they would now have to create their own country. By the 19th century, talk of a Jewish country had started spreading among Jews everywhere. Around this time, on May 2, 1860, a Jewish man named Theodor Herzl was born in Hungary. He himself had experienced many anti-Jewish policies and the hatred of Europeans. He started a movement called Zionism and promoted the demand for a Jewish country. During this time, he wrote a book titled The Jewish State. In this book, for the first time, he called on Jews living all over the world to create their own country. Herzl was a journalist by profession, and he was the first in the 19th century to raise his voice for the Jews and for their own country. His ideas from the Jewish state began to influence Jews spread all over the world. Then Herzl formed a Jewish political committee called the Zionist Organization, and its first meeting was held in Switzerland in 1897. After this meeting, Jews from all over the world began sending money to this organization to support the Zionist movement. In no time, this organization collected a lot of money, enough to establish a country of their own for the Jews. At that time, the slogan, "Death to the Jews," was echoing throughout Europe, which was spreading a lot of fear among entire Jewish families. In such circumstances, Herzl called upon Jews from all over the world to come to their homeland, Israel, which had now become Palestine. After his call, a large number of Jews began moving towards their homeland, Israel. Herzl was convinced that it was impossible to eliminate anti-Semitism from Europe, and because of this, Jews would always have to live a life full of suffering. That is why he intensified the demand for a Jewish state. In response to his call, once again, the caravan of Jews began moving toward Palestine. Everyone set out for Palestine in whatever way they could manage. Some people, driven by anti-Semitism, even crossed the desert on foot to reach Palestine. Because at that time Palestine was under the control of the Ottoman Empire, there were no restrictions on Jews coming there. The event of Jews migrating from Europe to Palestine was called Aliyah. In response to Herzl's call, the first Aliyah took place between 1882 and 1903, during which about 35,000 Jews returned to Israel. After this, the second Aliyah occurred between 1904 and 1914, when again about 40,000 Jews came to Israel. Meanwhile, World War I began. Even during this period, about 40,000 Jews came to Palestine. But even after coming to Palestine, the Jews were living here like fugitives. The Jewish people established their settlements in the border areas. However, the Jews had considerable wealth which they wanted to use to develop their own cities, schools, hospitals, and culture. The Jews wanted to establish their own country at any cost, and the British were well aware of this. At that time, the Jews in America were quite prosperous and wealthy, and they were mainly the ones sending money to the Zionist organization. After America entered World War I, the Jews also became somewhat pro-British. Taking advantage of this, around 1917, the British Empire sought financial help from the Jews to boost its weakening economy and cover the expenses of warfare. In return, they said that if the Jews helped them financially and if the British won World War I, they would help the Jews establish their own country, Israel. Trusting this promise from the British, the Jews supported them. At that time, this proposal was made between the Jews and the British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour, which is also known as the Balfour Declaration. Trusting this promise, the Jewish people provided financial support to the British against the Ottomans. In this war, the Ottoman Empire was defeated and Palestine came under British control. When Palestine came under British rule, Jews from all over the world began moving towards Palestine. Jewish leaders noticed that people were coming from different places and their dialects, languages, and lifestyles were all different from one another. So, to bring uniformity to the entire Jewish society, they established a city and named it the city of Tel Aviv. Here, Jewish leaders tried to revive the Hebrew language, which was the ancient language of the Jews, and bring it back into use. Schools were opened to teach the Hebrew language. Newspapers, public announcements, and prayers were all promoted in the Hebrew language, which helped the Jews become more strongly connected with each other. The growing Jewish population and the British. Because Palestine, which was mainly Muslim, came under occupation, the people there began to feel afraid, and this is where the conflict over dominance in Palestine between Arabs and Israelis began. Both sides wanted to claim their rights over Palestine. The Palestinians started to fear that the British might take away their land and give it to the Jews. After this, the Palestinians revolted against the Jews and the British army, and to suppress this, the British allowed only 10,000 Jews per year to immigrate to Palestine. But due to the rising anti-Semitism in Poland, Russia, and Germany, millions of Jews started coming to Palestine illegally, disregarding any rules. Meanwhile, the Jews developed agricultural land in their city and began farming. In addition, the Histadrut, which was a labor organization, was also established. After that, they also established an elected assembly, their own national council, and the Haganah, which was Israel's defense force. In a way, they had started to build their own country in Palestine. But meanwhile, due to the rise of Hitler in Germany, Jewish people began to face severe persecution, and as a result, millions of Jews started fleeing and returning to their homeland, Israel. Because of the increasing Jewish population, conflicts in Palestine intensified. But this time, the Jews were not in the mood to run away. They prepared their forces, with which they were even winning the civil war against Palestine. From 1933 to 1938, there were several civil wars in Palestine in which many Jews and Muslims were killed. Meanwhile, Amin al-Husseini, who was the Mufti of Jerusalem and the president of the Arab Higher Committee, tried to befriend Hitler in order to drive the Jews out of Palestine by force. He wanted to go to Germany and join Hitler's army so that a Muslim SS army could also be formed in Palestine and the same treatment could be meted out to the Jews in Palestine as was happening in Germany at that time. Hitler never gave much importance to the Mufti, but the Mufti befriended Adolf Eichmann, who was considered Hitler's right-hand man. After this, during World War II, the British completely sealed the borders of Palestine, making it impossible for Jews to enter Palestine. In such a situation, other countries also closed their doors to Jews. In 1939, World War II began, during which around 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust, and those who survived somehow managed to escape to Israel. After enduring the horrific pain of the Holocaust, the Jews' patience had finally run out. They once again began to pressure the British Empire to establish their own country. This time, the Jews were not among those who would back down. They took up arms so that Israel could become an independent nation. Now, the Israelis began forcefully bringing Jews who had survived the Holocaust into their country, going against Britain.